There's something you haven't said out loud yet, but it's been gnawing at the back of your mind every time you close your eyes in prayer and hear nothing but silence. You used to feel something. Now, all you feel is distant. Like the line went dead, but nobody told you. The verses still echo in your memory. The songs still give you chills sometimes. You know the language of faith. You've repeated it your whole life, but lately, it's been hollow. Like you're mouthing the words to a song you no longer believe in, hoping that maybe if you just sing louder, the feeling will come back. But it doesn't, and you're scared. Scared of what it might mean. Scared that the fire you once had was fake. Scared that maybe it was all emotional hype. Or worse, that you're the problem. That fear has a name, but no one around you dares say it. They call it weakness. They call it backsliding. They call it rebellion. But it's none of those things. You're not losing your faith. You're burning the illusion of it. What you're feeling isn't absence. It's awakening, because there comes a moment on the spiritual path where the version of God you were handed no longer fits the questions your soul is asking. And that moment is violent. It shakes everything. It leaves you feeling like a stranger in the temple you once called home. You look around and see others still clapping, still dancing, still shouting, "Amen." And you wonder if they're feeling what you feel, or just pretending like you've been pretending. You used to pray with urgency. You used to worship with passion. You used to believe without hesitation. But now, something's shifted. It's not that you want to leave your faith behind. It's that your soul can no longer carry the weight of a belief system that feels more like a performance than a connection. And no one prepared you for that. No one warned you that one day your spirit might outgrow the version of faith that once saved you. No one told you that real growth often begins where certainty dies. No one said that healing would sometimes look like spiritual silence, so you feel alone. Not because God left you, but because everything you used to lean on stopped making sense. You try to go back. You replay the sermons. You try to reignite the feeling. You beg for that old spark to return. But deep down, something in you already knows. The spark isn't coming back because it was never meant to. You're not being punished. You're being called deeper. But deeper doesn't feel like glory at first. It feels like death. The death of the God you thought you knew. The death of the theology that kept you safe. The death of the spiritual identity that made you feel special. And you mourn it, even if you don't say it out loud. You mourn the days when faith was simple, when you didn't have questions, when you could just believe what they told you and sleep at night. But you can't unknow what you've begun to see. You can't unfeel the disconnect between what's preached and what you're experiencing. You can't keep pretending the formula works when your soul is starving in a room full of noise. This is the part of the journey no one talks about. The part where doubt doesn't mean you've turned away from God. It means you're finally turning toward truth. You're no longer satisfied with emotional highs that fade by Monday. You're no longer moved by promises that never manifest. You're no longer comforted by cliches that once kept you numb, because now you want something real, even if it costs you everything you were taught to protect. And maybe that's why everything's gone quiet, not because you've lost your connection, but because God is pulling you out of the crowd, out of the noise, out of the scripts, into the wilderness, where the voice is not loud, but low, where the presence is not performative, but penetrating, where the answers are not instant, but intimate. And in that wilderness, you begin to realize you're not being punished for your doubt. You're being purified by it, because the faith that survives this silence, the one that walks through this fire and doesn't run back to what's comfortable, that's the faith that can't be faked. That's the faith that doesn't need a platform or a spotlight. That's the kind of faith that sets you free. They told you faith would fix everything, that if you just believed hard enough, obeyed deeply enough, and prayed consistently enough, your life would align, that storms would calm, doubts would vanish, and peace would descend like a blanket over your chaos. But here you are, years in, and the formula stopped working. You did everything they said. You followed the rule. You tithed. You forgave, you served, and still, life happened. You were left. You were hurt. You were confused. You cried out, and the silence answered back. And no one had a script for that. because they never told you what to do when the God you were taught to worship doesn't show up the way you were taught to expect. So you begin to question, not out of rebellion, but out of heartbreak. You start to wonder if the faith you inherited was real, or if it was just conditioning wrapped in ritual. Because when you really think about it, how much of your faith was yours to begin with? Was it born out of your own soul, or was it passed down in whispers of fear and control, disguised as obedience? Were you told to seek God because He's truth, or because you were warned not to burn in hell? This is the uncomfortable line most people never want to walk, because asking these questions means shaking the very foundation that once gave you comfort. But what if that comfort was a cage? What if the version of God you were taught to love, the one who punished every mistake, kept score of every sin, demanded perfection, wasn't God at all, but an idol made out of fear, tradition, and power? You see, spiritual systems have always known one thing: fear keeps people obedient. Fear makes people small. Fear makes people dependent. So the more terrified you are of disappointing God, the more tightly you cling to the ritual. You stop asking, you stop thinking, you stop feeling, you just perform. You learn how to dress holy, how to speak holy, how to worship like everyone's watching. But inside, your soul is starving, because somewhere along the way, the faith that was supposed to set you free became a prison you didn't even know you were in. And it's not that your faith was fake, it was just incomplete. It was built on borrowed language, on external rules. It was shaped to make you fit into a system, not to help you connect to the divine. And when that realization hits, it doesn't feel like enlightenment. It feels like betrayal. Betrayal of the church that raised you, of the leaders you admired, of the community that once gave you identity, and maybe even of God. But here's the paradox. You're not betraying God by questioning the version of Him you were taught. You're honoring Him by seeking the truth, because truth doesn't fear questions. Only illusions do. So the moment you begin to peel back the layers of religious performance, when you start to ask what parts of your faith were truly yours, and what parts were inherited under pressure, that's when you begin to shift from believing by default to believing by choice. And it's terrifying. You start noticing how often guilt was used as a leash, how often shame was dressed up as reverence, how often your desire to feel safe was manipulated to keep you silent. You remember the sermons that made you feel like nothing you did was ever enough, the prayers that taught you to beg instead of commune, the idea that you had to earn grace, as if it were ever supposed to be a transaction. So many of us confuse obedience with intimacy. We think if we check all the boxes, God will love us more. But real faith, the kind that endures storms and silence and collapse, doesn't live in boxes. It lives in the tension. It lives in the questions. It lives in the space between losing everything you thought was holy and discovering what actually is. That space is not the end of faith. It's the beginning, because when you strip away the performance, the rituals, the guilt-driven behaviors, what's left? What's real? What can't be shaken? What survives when the illusion of faith has burned away? That's what you're moving toward now. Not a faith built on fear, not a belief system built to control, but a living connection with the sacred that doesn't require you to shrink, fake, or hide. And maybe that's why you feel so lost right now, because the mask you wore in the name of faith is finally falling off. And underneath that mask is someone God actually knows. Not the version of you who knew all the verses, not the one who always said the right thing, but the raw, aching, doubting, questioning you. The you who wants truth more than comfort. The you who is willing to burn down the old altar if it means finding something real. And that is where real faith begins to rise. There's a strange kind of guilt that grows in silence, a guilt not born from doing something wrong, but from thinking something unspoken. It starts like this, a prayer that feels hollow, a verse that used to comfort you suddenly falls flat, a Sunday morning where you show up, but only your body is there. And you begin to wonder, what's wrong with me? Why can't I feel God the way I used to? Why does worship feel like routine instead of revelation? But no one told you that these questions were sacred. You were taught that doubt was dangerous, that questioning was a slippery slope, that silence from heaven meant you had messed up. So instead of asking, you perform. You say what's expected. You nod at the right time. You raise your hands even when your heart is somewhere else. Because you're afraid of what people might think if you said what you really feel. You're afraid they'll label you lost, afraid God will turn away, afraid the fragile threads holding your faith together will finally snap. But let me offer you a truth. Most communities are too afraid to say out loud. Real faith is not born in certainty. It's forged in doubt. What if the questions you're afraid to ask are the very doorway to the next level of your faith? What if the silence isn't punishment, but space for something deeper to be born? Look at the stories that shaped belief. Moses doubted. David cried out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Even Jesus, in his most human moment, felt the weight of abandonment. And yet, we've built a culture that treats any flicker of doubt like a virus. We're taught to bury it, to rebuke it, to silence it with louder praise. But praise that drowns out doubt isn't faith. It's fear wearing a halo. You weren't created to be a puppet on spiritual autopilot. You were created to wrestle, to seek, to question, to grow. And growth is messy. It doesn't fit neatly inside devotionals or prepackaged sermons. It looks like the middle of the night when you stare at the ceiling and whisper, "Are you still there?" It looks like closing your Bible not because you're rebelling, but because you can't read another word that feels disconnected from your reality. It looks like stepping outside the places you once called holy, just to breathe and see if God still meets you in the tree, the silence, the ache. And slowly, something begins to shift. You start to realize that the doubt didn't come to destroy your faith. It came to purify it, to separate the genuine connection from the inherited routine, to burn off the layers of fear, obligation, and control. Because if your faith can't survive a question, was it ever faith at all? True faith doesn't need to be protected from doubt. It welcomes it. It honors it. It knows that questions are not threats. They're invitations. Invitations to go deeper, to stop outsourcing your spiritual life to others, to find out for yourself who God is when no one's watching. And that's the most terrifying and holy space of all, to sit in the in-between, not where you used to be, but not yet where you're going. This is the wilderness, where the old beliefs no longer hold, and the new ones haven't fully formed, where your soul stretches beyond the fences it once thought were freedom, where everything feels like it's falling apart, but underneath, something sacred is quietly being rebuilt. You start to notice moments that feel different now, when a song doesn't just move you emotionally, but shakes you spiritually, when a silence feels fuller than a sermon, when a conversation with someone equally lost feels more honest than years of church small talk. And you start to ask yourself, what if this doubt is actually the beginning of intimacy? Not the kind you perform in public, but the kind you experience when it's just you and God, and everything is stripped away. No more pretending, no more spiritual vocabulary for applause, just present, just truth, just the rawness of being seen, questions and all. Because it turns out, God never asked you to be certain. He just asked you to come close, even when your voice shakes, even when you don't know what to say, even when your hands are empty and your heart is full of questions. That kind of closeness, it's not weak, it's sacred. It's the kind of faith that doesn't need to shout, because it has survived the silent. There comes a moment in every spiritual journey when you realize the God you've been worshiping isn't God at all. It's unsettling. You've spoken His name. You've cried out to Him. You've built your entire life around what you were told He expects. But now, as everything starts to crumble, you feel it deep in your bones that maybe what's collapsing isn't your connection to God, but the structure that kept Him small. Because somewhere along the way, faith stopped feeling like freedom and started feeling like fear. You were told God sees everything, but they didn't tell you that message came with a hidden threat. Behave or be punished. Submit or be silenced. Believe exactly as you're told or be cast out. And you tried. You tried to fit yourself into that mold. You tried to align your humanity with the blueprint of someone else's God, a God who needed performance more than honesty, who demanded worship but gave no space for weakness, who claimed to love you but only conditionally. And now that God is fading, not because God has left you, but because your soul can no longer sustain the weight of an idol built from fear. That's what this part of the journey is, the unraveling of the image. The image of God shaped not in truth, but in control. The image used to enforce obedience, to sustain systems, to silence dissent. And for so long, you didn't question it, because questioning felt like betrayal. But here's the revelation no one ever offered you. You're not betraying God by letting go of the lie. You're finally making room for Him. The collapse isn't destruction, it's refinement. You're not falling away from God. You're falling out of the illusion that stood in His place. It's like stepping out of a painted room you've lived in your whole life and realizing the sky was always outside the window. You start to see it in the small things. That verse they used to shame you suddenly takes on a different tone when read in silence. The rule that once felt sacred begin to feel suspiciously man-made. You notice how the loudest voices in the room often sound nothing like love. You begin to untangle what you were told from what you actually feel. And that's where things get complicated. Because for years, you were taught that your feelings couldn't be trusted, that your heart is deceitful, that your thoughts are dangerous. But what if that was never about truth? What if it was about power? Because a person who trusts their own spirit is much harder to control. You were trained to believe in external authority, in the voice behind the pulpit, in the system that defines who's in and who's out. But God has been whispering something else all along, hasn't He? In the moments when you stood under the night sky and felt small but safe. In the moments when your tears said more than your theology ever could. In the moments when silence felt more holy than a sermon. That wasn't rebellion. That was recognition. Recognition that God isn't limited to what you were taught. Recognition that maybe, just maybe, He never asked for the show. You start to remember how often you prayed with more fear than faith, how often you measured your spiritual health by how well you obeyed, not how deeply you connected, how much energy you spent performing for a God who might never have asked you to. And suddenly, the pressure starts to lift, not because the questions disappear, but because you realize they were never your enemy. What's breaking isn't your relationship with God. It's your relationship with the idea that He needed you to be perfect. The God that demanded endless striving, emotional suppression, blind loyalty. That wasn't the divine. That was the mask placed over Him. A mask worn by broken systems, insecure leaders, and old fears passed down like gospel. And now you're choosing to take it off. But of course, that's not easy. Because even as the illusion dissolves, there's grief. Grief for the time you lost trying to earn what was always unconditional. Grief for the parts of yourself you hid to be accepted by a God who, it turns out, already knew you. Grief for the people you trusted who now see your questions as rebellion instead of revelation. You find yourself torn between the old and the new, the God you can no longer serve and the God you are just beginning to know. And in this middle ground, there's tension. You may lose belonging, you may face rejection, you may walk alone for a while. But even in that loneliness, there's a strange peace, a quiet voice that doesn't demand, but invites, that doesn't condemn, but gently uncovers. And that voice doesn't sound like the ones you used to follow. It sounds like something ancient, something deeper, something real. It sounds like home. You thought the fire had gone out, that the silence meant abandonment, that the absence of emotion meant the absence of God, that your doubts disqualified you, that because you stopped feeling it, you must have lost it. But what if the fire didn't die? What if it transformed? What if the silence wasn't emptiness, but space for something real to grow? What if what you called losing your faith was actually the painful, necessary process of finding the only kind that could survive the weight of your soul? Because there's a kind of faith that only lives in the light, the kind that sings when it's easy, the kind that believes when everything aligns, the the kind that flourishes as long as the feelings are there, as long as the community agrees, as long as the path is smooth. But then comes the fracture, the disappointment, the unanswered prayer, the betrayal by someone who spoke in the name of God, the unraveling of beliefs that once held you together. And when those moments arrive, that first kind of faith doesn't know what to do. Because it wasn't built for storms, it was built for appearances. You begin to realize the difference between a faith inherited and a faith earned. Not earned through works or performance, but earned through fire, through wrestling, through nights of silence and mornings of confusion, through the ache of not knowing and still choosing to stay. That's the faith that changes, that doesn't need a stage or applause, that doesn't have to be shouted to be real, that doesn't crumble under question. It grows through them. This kind of faith is quieter, but it's stronger because it's not rooted in tradition. It's rooted in truth, not in certainty, but in surrender, not in fear, but in freedom. And it only arrives after everything else burns away. Maybe that's what the collapse was really about. Not punishment, not failure, but purification. Because before, your faith may have been about keeping God close enough to please, but not close enough to transform. Now, He's everywhere, not just in the sacred spaces, but in the raw, unfiltered moment, in the stillness of a dark room, in the breath you didn't know you were holding, in the tears that finally fell when you stopped pretending. You feel Him in the ache, in the questions, in the freedom of letting go. And you realize something no one ever told you. The faith that survives doubt is the only kind that sets you free, because it's not blind, it's open, it's not rigid, it's resilient. It doesn't need to be explained because it's felt, not all the time, not always loudly, but deeply. You stop needing to defend what you believe because you're no longer believing to belong. You're believing because you know, because you've touched something in the dark that no sermon could have given you, and because it didn't leave when your certainty did. You finally know it's real. You no longer need the fear-based narrative to keep you moral. You no longer need guilt to keep you humble. You no longer need emotional highs to remind you God exists, because now you carry that truth like a quiet fire inside your chest. You know who you are. You know whose you are. You know you're not lost. You're being remade. And maybe that's the greatest miracle of all, that your faith didn't die in the fire. It was refined by it. So if you're still in the silence, trust that something sacred is unfolding beneath the noise. If you're still in the in-between, know that the journey is part of the knowing. If you're still deconstructing, honor the courage it takes to ask better questions, because the faith that walks through doubt, the faith that survives collapse, the faith that loses the image and finds the present, that's not weakness. That's the beginning of real liberation. And if this spoke to the ache you've been carrying in secret, say something in the comments below. Not for validation, but to remind someone else they're not alone. And when you're ready, there's another layer waiting for you in the next video. Click it. You've come too far to stop now.